Hello and welcome to Worlds Apart. Going against the tide and defying the so-called Washington consensus is never easy, especially if your country's entire financial system and international reputation are at stake. And yet this is precisely what allowed Iceland, the first country to be hit by the global financial crisis, to also become one of the first to emerge from the dire straits. What are the pros and cons of having your own way, both in the global economy and in global politics? Well, to discuss that, I'm now joined by none other than the President of Iceland, Ólafur Grímsson. Mr. President, it's an honor for me to have you in the studio. Thank you very much for that. Now, as I just said, Iceland was the first country to be hit extremely hard by the global financial crisis. And 5 years on, who do you think was to blame for that? Was it the bankers? Was it the individual governments? Or perhaps the whole system of runaway capitalism?
To some extent, we were all to blame for it, especially those of us who had been involved for a long time in political affairs, in the business side of our economy, and even the prevailing spirit of the times. As you know, the theory came out of America and Britain in the 70s and the 80s, that the more you deregulated, the more freedom you gave to the financial markets, the more you privatized, everybody would be prosperous, everybody would be happy. And this was an ideology which was presented as economic science. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, we found out when the banks collapsed that this formula was poisonous, was dangerous, and it was a very costly experience, a very challenging experience. But in the years since, we have learned some very hard lessons, which will be with us for a long time.
And if I can pick up on this point, I know that in many of your speeches, you stressed that you believe that that crisis presented a major threat not only to your country's economic well-being, but also to your entire political system and democracy. And I think this is a very unusual notion for a Western politician, because it's somehow assumed in the West that once you become a democratic country, once you join the club, you are there forever. And yet you seem to be suggesting that even an established democracy can go backwards, and this may happen in a relatively short period of time.
Well, this is a very important point, because the main pillar, perhaps, of this financial ideology that has been called the Western consensus, and you mentioned in the beginning, has been that financial markets and democracy would always go hand in hand. They would always move forward in a harmony. There would never be an inherent conflict. And this then developed also from the Thatcher and the Reagan years into a notion that of the fundamental parts of our societies, the market was supreme. So politics and society became very secondary. It was supposed that the markets would bring democracy, social harmony, and everything else. And Iceland was a very interesting testing case for this theory, because it is difficult to find a country which is more peaceful, more secure, with a democratic tradition ranging back to a parliament which was established 1,000 years ago. But within a few months after the banks had collapsed, this solid, strong democratic tradition was fundamentally threatened. There were riots in the streets, the police had to defend the parliament day and night, had to prevent the crowd from taking over the central bank. We had almost a revolutionary situation.
And when a country like Iceland, with such long democratic traditions, faces such a challenge, what would you expect from, well, countries who have been less fortunate historically, who couldn't develop, who don't have such a long history of democracy and peaceful development as Iceland?
If I may just make that point, because what happened in Iceland is a demonstration of how the breakdown of the financial system can threaten democracy in one of the most secure democratic countries in the world. Then imagine, as you were saying, what can happen in countries that only have a few decades of
but
democratic history.
But we don't even have to imagine. We can look at the Arab world, for example, countries that don't have established democratic traditions. They very quickly reverted to violence, and some of that violence was not only driven politically, but also economically.
I sometimes mention the fact, which we tend to forget in Europe, that during the first years of my life, there were only 6 democracies in Europe. The rest of Europe sort of under either fascist, Nazi or communist dictatorship. So even in Europe, the future of democracy is not given, and the financial crisis has taught us this, that we cannot move forward on the assumption that whatever we do, democracy is going to be secure. That's not the case, and the banks, the financial markets and the economic authorities in every country carry an enormous democratic responsibility. And that is, to acknowledge that, is something new, because for over 30 years, the prevailing theory was the markets, the companies, the banks don't carry any democratic responsibility.
Absolutely, and I think many of your counterparts in continental Europe would argue that democracy has by now taken over Europe, but yet, if we look at just this recent history, Iceland was one of the very few, if not the only country, to actually consult its people on whether to bail out the banks. And I think the treatment that your country was subjected to for just asking its people was less than friendly. Your country was called names. You were threatened that nobody will ever deal with Iceland ever again. You even had an anti-terror legislation invoked against Iceland by Britain. I wonder if you, as president, were surprised by all these campaign of intimidation from your traditional
Well,
allies.
I was not only surprised. I mean, it created surroundings for the most difficult decision I have ever had to take. Because when, in the beginning of 2010, we had tried to negotiate with Britain and the Netherlands in order to get the IMF program for Iceland going, we had the so-called ISAVE agreement. And this agreement, which was forced on us by a pressure executed by almost every government in Europe, meant that ordinary people of Iceland, farmers, fishermen, teachers, nurses, would have to pay through their taxes for decades for the failure of the private banks. So I came to these crossroads. Should I let people decide or just surrender to these threats? And every government in Europe had the opinion you should not allow the people to decide. That if I had a referendum, it was not only wrong, it was fundamentally dangerous. And people were saying I would isolate Iceland for decades, we would become a pariah state and many other things. But my view was this: when I had analyzed this issue in its complex way, there was a very simple truth at the bottom, and that was the choice: what is more important, democracy, the will of the people, or the interest of the financial markets? And I've said to many leaders in Europe in recent years, what is Europe's major contribution to the world? It's not financial markets. Europe's most important contribution to the world is democracy, the rule of law, and human rights. Well, and when Europe faces a fundamental crisis of its own, why don't we go with the elements that have been the most important European contribution to the world?
But I think when we speak about democracy, some people would argue that for the Western world, it has become a sort of ideology, and an ideology that you press upon others very harshly. But when
I agree with you there. I've often said that. It has taken us in Western Europe decades and centuries to develop the kind of democracy. So this whole notion that Europe has always been in an easy way democratic and it's an easy journey to take on, and therefore other countries should become democratic in 5 years or 10 years, it's completely unrealistic.
I don't know if you would agree with me, but in the beginning of this crisis, there were a lot of efforts, or at least some efforts, to reconsider the principles on which the global economy is run. And some politicians, many decision makers, were talking about the need to, readdress those principles. But I would argue that, nowadays, essentially the tyranny of the status quo, borrowing the phrase from Milton Friedman, seems to be prevailing. Do you think the world has really learned the lessons of the crisis? Do you think the underlying reasons for that crisis have been addressed?
You're absolutely correct that the re-examination that many of us thought would then take place kind of fizzled out and disappeared from the agenda. Then again, of course, there are some lessons that have been learned, and it was very interesting when the IMF program was over in Iceland. We gave a farewell conference to the IMF. I think we are the only country that's formally had a farewell conference when the IMF program was over. And the high officials of the IMF were intellectually honest enough to acknowledge that maybe they had learned more from dealing with the Icelandic crisis than they had taught us. And now we know that what they were arguing with respect to us, and more than arguing, what they were advocating and pressurizing us to do, turned out to be not only economically wrong and democratically wrong, but also illegal.
I think they absolutely have to have the moral and intellectual honesty to concede that, but that would also require reassessing the whole economic theory, the so-called economic orthodoxy that you so often refer to. And I already mentioned Milton Friedman, one of the gurus of Western economic thought, and I know that back in the 80s you had a chance to debate with him, and what struck me about that debate is that he used the phrase welfare state in an almost pejorative sense, and at some point he almost accused you of siding with the communists and the oppressors. Let's listen to what he had to say about your ideas at the time.
Those societies that have tried to carry out the views you're now expressing are the societies of misery, of tyranny, of slavery. The ideas you're expressing are the ideas that were expressed by the leaders of the Soviet Union. They were the ideas that were expressed by the leaders of China. They are the ideas that have been expressed in every country that has sought to go down the direction you're describing, has ended up with tyranny and misery.
Now, it was 30 years ago.
Well, you have to acknowledge I was much younger then.
Yeah, and it was a long time ago, but I think using the American phrase, you are on the right side of history here, because if you look around the world now, I think we will find that it is primarily welfare states, those countries that have integrated both the elements of the capitalist system and some of the elements of socialist system that are doing fairly well both economically and socially. And I wonder if you feel like time of history vindicated your personal views, and most importantly, if you feel that capitalism in its purest form, as advocated by Friedman, is just as unsustainable as socialism in its purest form.
Well, I think the problem with this argument that Milton Friedman was advocating, and problem with many of my friends in America, both in the business world and the academic world, is that they still think that what we call welfare society in the Nordic countries and a competitive capitalistic market system cannot go hand in hand. And that is why I have often pointed out, and many others have done so as well, if you take the 5 Nordic countries, we are over 20 million people. So we don't have to debate the theory. We have a practical laboratory of the Nordic countries, which are by all measures always ranking among the top countries in terms of a competitive market economy. But they are also among the top countries in terms of welfare policies, the right to health care, education, equality of women, social policies. So we have proved, together with the Finns and the Swedes and the Norwegians and the Danes, that you are successful in international global market competition if you build a strong welfare society. Because the entire business community in the Nordic countries is in favor of the welfare state, the right to education and healthcare and everything else, because they have seen from decades of experience that it's fundamentally good for business. Whereas in America, You have a system where the big corporations and the companies have to worry about the health insurance and the welfare of their employees, and if the company goes bankrupt, the pensions and the social rights of the workers and the people who were employed by the company simply wither away. So we don't have to debate this any longer. We now have over 30 years of a track record, not just by my country, but the other Nordic countries as well.
Mr. President, we have to take a short break now, but when we come back, defying the economic orthodoxy allowed Iceland to quickly emerge from the crisis. But what is the price of dissent in global politics? That's coming up in a few moments on Worlds Apart. Welcome back to Worlds Apart, where we are discussing the pros and cons of doing it your way with Iceland's President Olafur Grimsson. Mr. Grimsson, Iceland seems to be so far removed from the rest of the world. I wonder if you yourself and your people pay any attention to what is happening in the rest of the world. I'm sorry for putting it so bluntly. What I mean, of course, is the major geopolitical events and the geopolitical clash over Syria. Do you think there is any interest in that in your country? Of
course, Iceland is a country which is an integral part of the global community, and the people of Iceland follow very closely events, human rights issues, situation of war and refugees in other parts of the world. So we try to play our part, both through our membership in the United Nations, in NATO, and in other organizations.
I know that your country has a long-standing policy of neutrality. You don't have a standing army in Iceland. I wonder, where does it leave you? Where does it leave Iceland on the issue of military intervention? Do you support it alongside most of the European countries, or do you oppose it?
Well, I don't think it is a true statement to say most European countries favor a military intervention. I think, on the contrary, I think most European countries,
leaders have spoken in favor
most
of
European countries have welcomed the results sorry, of the dialogue between Russia and the United States, between President Putin and Obama and your foreign minister and the Secretary of State. And I had a meeting with Ban Ki-moon just 2 days ago, and the essence of our discussion there was our strong support for the United Nations as the legal framework for dealing with these issues. Because if you look at the experience of Iraq, of the Middle East, the situation in Syria and elsewhere, you draw one lesson from this experience, that it's an extremely complicated territory, that you have conflicting historical, religious, and even tribal interests. And for us in the West to try to superimpose our political model on a territory which is almost completely without such a history can lead to disastrous results.
You mentioned, we talked about in the first part about this idea of economic orthodoxy and the pressure of the consensus. And I wonder if you can apply the same idea to the political sphere, because I think many people in Russia would feel similar to what you felt 5 years ago on the economic side, that once you go against the tide, once you challenge the predominant, in this case, Western opinion, you're subjected to all sorts of shaming, you're subjected to all sorts of incriminations. Even if you just dare to voice your opinion, which happens to be different from Western opinion, do you think there's still a price to pay in global politics for not conforming, not going along with predominant Washington consensus?
Of course there can be a price, of course, and that is why I told you before, when I took the decision to go against every government in Europe by allowing the people of Iceland to vote, have a referendum. It was the riskiest decision I've ever taken, and it required a very deep conviction in order to go against, as I said, every government in Europe. But the people of Iceland were behind that decision. And I've often said, when people ask me, what have you learned from your long public service and political career? And the answer is really simple. To trust the people, and I mean the ordinary people, their inner wisdom and their guidance. They are often much more sophisticated in their analysis of what matters than the so-called experts or the leaders of countries. And when we approach other parts of the world, we should also humbly remember in Europe that it was not easy for us to become democratic. It was a costly exercise.
And it took you a lot of time.
There were millions and millions of Europeans who died in European wars and European conflicts within the lifetime of myself and my parents in order to make Europe democratic. So for us in Europe to try to tell other parts of the world that there is somehow a magic formula where you can create democracy and a society of human rights in a matter of few years cannot be told from our own European experience. And if it didn't succeed for us, how on earth can we expect others to do it quickly?
It's very refreshing to hear something like that from a Western politician. Now, you just mentioned your long history of public service. Let me ask you a personal question. You just won a record 5th term, and if you serve till the end of that term, you will have been in power for 20 years. And I think there are a lot of leaders around the world, in China, in this country in particular, who have been criticized for so-called clinging to power for much shorter periods of time. And I wonder, how long do you think is too long for a politician to dedicate to his service?
Well, if you had asked me when I was elected whether I thought 20 years was too long, I would have given you unhesitantly the answer, yes, of course it's too long. I intended to step down 2 years ago when my 4th term was over. And I actually made a trip to Antarctica with a group of friends and my wife to take a look at the melting of the ice in Antarctica. And while I was there, I couldn't have been further away. There was a petition started that people wanted me to stand again. Partly because of the uncertainties over many of these issues. And in the end, it became a moral question for myself, because I didn't intend to run for the 5th term. And I faced a situation where people had shown me an extraordinary trust by electing me, and now they wanted me to continue, and I had to repay that trust. Because as I said before, to me, the bond between somebody who was elected to represent the people, whether it's a president or a member of parliament, it is fundamentally a question of trust, If people elect representatives again, before we start condemning it, we should ask ourselves, maybe there are some wise reasons that people decided to do that. But of course, you have attempts of leaders to cling to power and want to be longer in office. But to me, this is fundamentally a service. It's not about power, and it's about trust, where I know I could lose the confidence of the Icelandic people next week. Nothing is given in this. So even if you're elected every 4 years, my experience tells me you have to earn their trust every day, every week, every month.
But I guess the same type of argument could be used by any other leader in any other country, no matter whether it's Iceland, China, for example, or
well, you don't have
Russia.
elections in China the same way as we have in Iceland. I mean,
you have a different historic tradition
yes,
from
sure.
China, and
right.
many Chinese experts and Chinese leaders would argue that what you have in the West or in America is a popularity contest, whereas in China they have a system of qualified choice. You cannot be unexperienced in order to be selected. But
since you're talking about that, I know you are very interested in the intellectual side of politics. A good friend of mine, an American-European businessman, Nicholas Begrudin, published together with a friend of his last year a very interesting book where he was arguing you take the best of the Chinese tradition and the best of the Western tradition and you try to combine those in a new type of political system. But I found it remarkable that a very respected Western businessman and intellectual was arguing that part of the solution to the European and the Western economic and financial crisis was to learn from some of the Chinese practices, as well as from our own democratic tradition.
Well, that leads me to actually my final question. I think we have to be open-minded, not just about accepting, some Chinese experience or some Western experience, but also maybe some Russian experience or some African experience. But staying on the issue of Russia and China, I think what's interesting about the relation between the West and these two countries is that some Western countries cannot afford not to deal with Russia and China, but they're sort of embarrassed about having to do that. And what's interesting to me personally about Iceland is that your country seemed to be very open-minded about dealing with, all sorts of countries without passing moral judgments. And I wonder, why don't you feel confined to any particular group? Because obviously you belong to the West, you are a European country with supposedly European democratic values, and yet you can afford to be open-minded about dealing with the world.
No, this is a very interesting point. I have strongly emphasized the need for my country to have constructive dialogue with the United States, and in a few weeks' time I'm bringing many distinguished leaders from the US to come to my country. But at the same time, I have felt it not only necessary, but very constructive and positive to engage with Russia and China. This is my third meeting with President Putin on the Arctic in the last few years. In the last 7 or 8 years, almost every year, I had a meeting with the President or the Prime Minister of China. So I don't accept that there is a conflict between being highly engaged with the US, as I have been for many years, or making state visits to Germany and France, and also being very constructively engaged with Russia and China. And when people are perplexed by that view, I ask them the question, how on earth are we going to construct a positive, dynamic global economy and a civilized society in the 21st century without a strong engagement from Russia and China? It's simply not possible.
Well, I think your solution is just treating other countries as equals. But, Mr. President, unfortunately, we have to leave it here. I really appreciate your time here. And to our viewers, please join us again. Same place, same time, here on Worlds Apart.